Okay, so hopefully folks are seeing the poll results. Nice, I'm glad to see the familiar levels with different policy. We'll get into more and more detail on that as we go through this. So now I'd like to invite our panelists to go on video. Get ready to go off mute and we will get started with our discussion. I guess I'll start with myself. I'm Raymond, and the Director of Social Impact and Advocacy at the North Face, also a CORP board member. And I am very excited to moderate this upcoming discussion on equitable access and outdoor policy wins. So with that, I wanted to invite our panelists to come off mute and start their introductions. Let's say, hear a little bit about you, what your work is, and what you're excited about to talk about today. So maybe we'll start with Alfredo.
Hey, Eric and everyone, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. Alfredo Gonzalez. I am a director at the Resources Legacy Fund. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva tribe in what is modern day Los Angeles. I lead efforts across the organization to engage different audiences, and in particular, communities of color, BIPOC communities, as well as younger audiences to engage in natural resource conservation and parks and access. The Resources Legacy Fund has been around for 20 years. We work at the intersection of policy and public funding for natural resources and conservation, working exclusively with policymakers and philanthropists to leverage big outcomes, and really looking forward to speaking with you all today.
Awesome, thanks, Alfredo. Les, you want to go next?
Sure thing. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Wow, the day is kind of moving by. My name is Les Duncan. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at Outdoor Outreach, a nonprofit organization here in San Diego, or otherwise known respectfully as the Kumeyaay Islands, the beautiful Kumeyaay Islands. And we are a nonprofit that introduces youth to the transformative power of the outdoors, while also really working to really elevate their voices in a lot of the policy work that we'll talk a little bit more about today as well.
Great, thanks, Les. Jaymee.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaymee Go. I'm calling in from Sacramento on Nisenan lands today, and I'm Vice President of Legislative Affairs at Priority Strategies, which is a public interest lobbying and consulting firm in Sacramento, where I work on conservation, climate, natural resource, and access issues. But as it relates specifically to access, I represent organizations like ASUL, Latino Outdoors, the LA River State Parks Partners, and also work with RLF in managing the Parks Now Coalition. And I'm also a board member at Green Info Network, which does mapping and makes tools that we actually use in this space, like the community fact finder that state parks used.
Awesome, thanks, Jaymee. We have one more panelist who are trying to get in shortly, and that's Marc Berejka with REI. Many of you probably dialing in are familiar with Marc, so once he's able to get in, we will ask him to do a short intro. But in the meantime, I think we'll get started. So first off, I want to start just by acknowledging, California, it's a diverse state. It's a leader in many aspects of outdoor recreation. We've heard some of the stats. We've heard from people who've said exactly that today. And so this discussion is to build on that morning session, to build on Member Friedman and Member Garcia's remarks, and to talk about policy and celebrate some wins. And so I think I want to acknowledge, one elephant in the room, which is COVID-19, which has shown, really we've heard and we've probably all felt how important the outdoors are to all of us. And we've all been hopefully recreating close to home. And so I think, part of this is digging into how important that is and how important it is to manage and support our outdoor recreation, removing barriers and helping everyone access those benefits. I talked a little bit about that just before lunch. I also want to talk a little bit more about my role at the North Face and as Director of Social Impact and Advocacy, I think about access to the outdoors in a few different ways. Most often that's through the lens of our Explore Fund grant program, which is which I'm excited to say, celebrating 10 years of work on equitable access to the outdoors, but also that's politically. And I want to just acknowledge, before CORP was formed, I mainly focused at the federal level, and I'd worked with California nonprofits to get more people connected to the benefits of being outside in the state. I also lobbied on climate issues, but with the progress that CORP has made in California over the last year or two, it's been pretty awesome getting more familiar with the state efforts and all of the work and leadership that's coming out of California. And as a result, I'm really excited for the discussion that we're about to get into. I know at the start of the day, for those of you who were there, we heard a little bit about wilderness and lands packages at the federal level. We'll hear a little bit more about federal policy. Oh, hey, Marc, great, in the near future. And we also heard about some of the challenges in creating equitable access to the outdoors. So we'll dive deeper into some of the ways that legislation is working to that end, how California is leading, and then how they can do more with our help. And before we dive into all of that stuff, looks like we have Marc online. So Marc, do you want to give a short introduction, and then we will get started?
Sure. I'll be super quick, and just for Zoom participants, know that if you enter and then get downgraded to a viewer, it's hard to get upgraded back to be a presenter. So I'm finally back. I have a role similar to Eric's. I oversee the government affairs and the philanthropy for REI. Turns out that REI's largest presence is in the state of California. We have thousands of employees, millions of members, and dozens of stores. So super proud to consider myself a representative of the co-op in California, albeit from a distance. I'm zooming in today from the Seattle suburbs, the heritage lands of the Duwamish peoples.
Awesome, thanks, Marc. And if I didn't clarify earlier, I am coming in virtually from Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands in Denver, Colorado. Awesome, so we'll get started. Jaymee, I'll start with you. Most of us spend the majority of time thinking about our business, or in Les's case, our work with youth. But you are mixing up with California legislators, working with policy every day. Could you start by grounding us a little bit in background on state politics? What are some of the current happenings related to outdoor recreation and access?
Yeah, definitely. It's actually a really exciting time to be working on this, since the momentum around passing policies and securing funding to promote outdoor access is growing in a way that we haven't really seen before. I think this year, like you mentioned, with the focus on responding to the pandemic, there were definitely some obstacles that forced advocates in the space to take a more defensive position to protect existing levels of access and existing funding for access programming. But I think we still saw an overwhelming number of organizations coalesce around these issues and successfully advocate both independently and as part of broader coalitions to ensure that equitable access stayed at the forefront of many of the policy and funding discussions, even during these kind of unprecedented times. And I think on top of that, there are also so many more organizations involved in these discussions, including those that have always been engaged, like the State Parks Foundation, some that are a little bit newer, like Parks California, which was actually established in legislation to be like a nonprofit partner to state parks and is really unique because of that. And also an increasing number of organizations that aren't really viewed as access organizations or outdoor recreation organizations, kind of like Audubon, California Trout, Trout Unlimited, and others that are leaning into these conversations more and lending their voice in support of these causes, in addition to facilitating their own programs to get kids outside. So one of the coalitions that I manage and work with personally, which I mentioned earlier, the Parks Now Coalition, has over 30 member organizations, and all of them have really different missions, but recognize the mental and physical health benefits of spending time outside, see somewhat of a nexus between that and what they do every day. And for that reason, also rally around equitable access and advocacy around it. And I think this year, a lot of those groups and others working in this space really had to pivot their efforts to respond to the situation and illustrate the unique value of outdoor recreation in the context of a pandemic, and shift advocacy towards keeping outdoor spaces like parks open with the appropriate safety measures, ensuring equitable guidance and messaging around responsible recreation during this time, protecting existing funding, and leading conversations surrounding other relevant but intersecting issues like over-policing of certain demographics in the outdoors, to really ensure that everyone feels welcome in these spaces. I think although the focus of most of the advocacy was certainly impacted by COVID, what's still one of the most amazing things to see is how much of an impact these collective efforts made, and how much of a priority equity and access has become, not only for the organizations spearheading these efforts, but also for the legislature that really went to bat in budget negotiations this year to keep funding for access programming despite everything else going on. The Resources Agency, who made equitable access one of their top priorities, and even the governor, who included an independent section on Parks for All in his January budget proposal, which is something I don't think has been elevated to that level in the budget before. And I know we're going to go into detail on the specific legislation and funding related to access later on, so I'm going to avoid talking about that now. But I think the last thing I'll mention is, as it relates to general outdoor recreation, the access landscape in Sacramento, recently Armando Quintero has been appointed as the new state parks director, and he's going to be picking up the mantle from the previous state parks director, Lisa Mengit, who we know was a huge supporter of promoting equitable access, and I'm sure is going to be missed at the department. But on the bright side, Director Quintero also appears really knowledgeable on access issues and has overseen the Yosemite Leadership Project at UC Merced. And it seems like he's equally motivated to improve diversity and inclusion, not only at state parks, but also other public lands. So even though I know he's just started, I think it's going to be really exciting to work with him and see how the department engages on these issues and continue the progress made so far under his leadership.
Yeah, I mean, there is no shortage of organizations and committees and agency resources focused on this. So kudos to you, Jaymee, for navigating all of that and for the work that you're doing. I mean, one of the organizations that is really mixing it up in this is RLF, and Alfredo, you've done a lot of work in the state around the issues of access, especially with the agency. And so I wanted to pose it to you. Could you share a little bit about your best guess at what's happening in the agency these days? What progress you've seen from your point? I know we heard from Secretary Crowfoot and Undersecretary Bronco earlier about their kind of main priorities, but I think your perspective will be valuable for everybody here.
Yes, thank you, Eric. So I want to just give a little bit of context, and then I'll sort of launch into this, because I've been working on these issues for over 10 years now, and it really feels like this is the moment. And this is, in the context of COVID, in the context of racial reckoning, in the context of right now the wildfires that are consuming the state of California, access and getting outdoors and sort of recreation and sort of access to natural resources are top of mind from the governor's office, secretary's office, all the way down to sort of the interpretive staff at state parks. So California has always had a pretty rich legacy around access, starting in the 70s with the Coastal Act. However, that has been sort of boutique. I mean, there's a lot of groups that have worked on access, but access hasn't been top of mind for the legislature or the administration up until, I would say, the last 5 or 6 years. I think it really came together around when Governor Jerry Brown was threatening to shut down state parks because of mismanagement and other issues. That really sort of compelled RLF and the funding community to come together to develop a process and steward a process to really reinvent the state park system. And that was Parks Forward, which Result recommendations for Parks Forward came out in 2015, and those recommendations we've been chipping away at everything from increasing and enhancing the technologies at state parks to creating programs for relevancy to identifying and sort of celebrating the cultural sort of history of California state parks and of the culture, the places in California. That really started, the legislature that we have today was not around 5 years ago, but they've really picked up that agenda, as has the governor, and is really sort of morphed into things that we've seen. The other thing that was really big that we saw after Parks Forward was Proposition 68, and this will be the last thing I say before I get into your question, Eric, around the agency itself. Proposition 68 was a $4 billion natural resources, parks and water bond. For the first time, in California, every 5 to 7 years, we go to the voters to ask them to tax themselves through a bond, essentially, to pay for the environment. That's how we pay for it. And typically, the environment gets the better hand of it. Proposition 68 was the first measure ever to really increase and elevate people and access. There is actually the largest sum of money in that measure is dedicated to building parks and park poor communities. There's language in that measure that allows for up to 5% of those $4 billion to be spent on capital for access, things like signage and things like that. So never before have we seen it, and we do owe a debt of gratitude to leaders like Mr. Garcia and Ms. Friedman, who really were sort of cheering that on. Now at the agency level, and you heard from Angela and from Wade earlier today, they've got a lot on their plate. 26 departments, agencies, commissions, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, all of the conservancies, CAL FIRE, 19,000 employees, and they've got a lot going on. And their top priorities are biodiversity, access, and climate resilience. And you heard a little bit about it. Given the context that we're working in, I think where the agency is going is not only sort of acknowledging the importance of access and doing some work around it. And you heard it from Angela. She wants to define access and make it more than just parks. People think of parks access and access to parks. She's thinking about access beyond that, natural lands, refuges, conserved lands that we typically don't have access to, and also everything from transportation to education to workforce development. What the agency, I think, will be doing in the sort of near future is securing the resources that already exist for access. We have a handful of revenue streams that are available to advance access. The idea of leveraging and scaling those investments is something they're looking into. Also, workforce development, you heard that also today. They're going to really look at their department and find out how they can get their department in a short amount of time to reflect the diversity of the state of California. We have what they're calling the silver tsunami, which is a lot of old white guys who are about to retire, and we need to figure out how to replace them in a way that's going to be true to California. And then, the other thing that they're looking to do is figure out how the existing programs both, and you heard this also, they're looking for partnerships. A lot of you in the outdoor industry have your own philanthropic arms. You do a lot of programming as well. Is there ways to leverage public funding with private funding to scale those kinds of investments and also identify where the best opportunities are and where the smartest opportunities are? Because there's a lot of programs out there, some better than others. And is there a way to start sort of figuring out how to leverage those things? So we see those as being sort of both the needs and the priorities of the agency, and we're just really excited to be working with Wade, Angela, and the governor's administration and the legislature on advancing these.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super great information. I think you guys have been so core to this. I wonder if you had just a minute to share with folks what you've learned over the years in working on this stuff with Sacramento and beyond, sort of what we might do from a business perspective. The attendees here will get into some virtual advocating later. Just a couple quick points of how we might approach these issues with legislators.
So just 2 to 3 really quick points. One is humans and access and people are now in the equation, and equity is in the equation. In the past, we would advance policy that was almost exclusively around natural resource conservation, natural resource habitat protection. Rarely did humans and things like access play into it, but the legislature is demanding that, not just in natural resources, but in all contexts. They're demanding, well, what's the human side of this and what's the equity side and justice side of this. And luckily we have leaders in both houses and in the administration that are advancing that. The other piece that's really good is that not just folks from the outdoor industry, but traditional conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, and others are embracing this, where typically you would expect them to sort of have some issues with it. And I'll let Jaymee speak a little more to this, but AB 3030 was a really good example. AB 3030, which is really a biodiversity habitat conservation bill, had a lot of equity and access and tribal consultation, things we would have never imagined even 3 years ago.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, there's been a lot of talk about California's leadership, and I think, that's really compelling for those of us who work outside the state. And I wanted to turn it over to Marc to take us up a level too for that conversation and talk a little bit about, what's happening from your perspective, Marc, at the federal level around, equity and access work and some of the wins that you've seen.
So I'll pick up on a phrase that Alfredo used. He said, this is the moment. And, we're all going to remember 2020 for a variety of reasons, most of them super challenging, like profoundly historically challenging. But 2018, 2019, 2020, in some regards, might also, if we stay together as a community, prove themselves to be a significant historical inflection point for this connection of humans to nature. Just in the last month, Congress put the final touches on and the president signed the Great American Outdoors Act, which puts almost $10 billion against the federal maintenance backlog on public lands and waters in the federal domain. And also for here on into the future, puts $900 million into the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So truly historic act by Congress in a Congress that is historically divisive. And then if you rewind the tape by, 15, 16 months and go back to March of last year, Congress also passed another major piece of legislation, the John Dingell Public Lands Act. And that was 700-800 pages of land and forest protections, river protections, plus the permanent reauthorization of LWCF. And so I think what you've found in DC is you've found a strong bipartisan appreciation for the fact that Americans in general just enjoy time outdoors. And while Republicans and Democrats will find reason to disagree on nearly everything, if well-crafted, well-curated, they can come together on this set of issues. Now, I don't mean to, push to the side, the grave harm being done presently by rollback of environmental regulations at the federal level, nor by continuing to ignore the real world impacts of climate change. I don't mean to diminish that in the least. But I do want to highlight that there is at least a bipartisan recognition of the value of connecting people to nature. And then with LWCF, I think, these bills that passed Congress, they passed 70, 80 to 30, 20 in the Senate, and over 300 votes in the House for each of those measures. And so it's support that's coming from every quarter of Congress. And in endorsing LWCF and fully funding it, people very well know that a lot of those dollars are going to go to states, and states will then have access to these federal monies to help implement some of those measures to address park poverty that Alfredo was just speaking to. So my hope is that we're on an inflection point and that we get through 2020 and for the issues that we care about, we're just able to continue the momentum.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Mark. And I mean, it's really interesting to think about, especially as we continue our work in California, to think about this interplay of, traditional conservation levers and legislation, and how that is sort of in place at a federal level, but also how things like LWCF allow us to take sort of that land work and bring the people element to it, which we're all focused on today. And I think it's that people element that is so compelling. And so I want, Les, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, taking it from the federal level or Marc down to sort of the local level, the local level, and how some of these policy decisions affect your work.
Absolutely. Well, first I'll start by just kind of echoing the tagline today, which is this year is really a moment. And we really are at a moment. I mean, again, just kind of acknowledging that in this year where we're experiencing a global pandemic, we're experiencing the racial awakening of America, for parks and for outdoor equity to still rise to this level of importance, I think can't be overstated. And one of the things that I think I would really credit that to also as a part of, as we're talking about policy advocacy wins, is the diversity of the movement, the growing diversity of the choir that's really championing not only conservation, but also access and equity in these spaces. We've seen a diversity of stakeholders coming to the table to advocate around climate change, around conservation. As a member of the Parks Now Coalition, we are one of a few dozen organizations across the state that are championing the outdoors as a critical part of public health and well-being. And even in the midst of COVID and our budget shortfalls, we've still been able to see outdoor equity kind of rise above and still be a key part of this administration's agenda. And so that's so important. The thing that I also want to acknowledge in that diversity of the movement, and how this movement can be so much more sustainable, is the youth engagement in this movement. So outdoor outreach, we work each year to engage thousands of youth through the transformative power of the outdoors, bringing them out surfing for the first time, bringing them out hiking, backpacking, rock climbing. For many of the youth that we work with in San Diego and a beach in a coastal city, for many of the youth that we work with, they live 15 minutes driving distance from the beach and have never touched sand, right? They live miles away from trails, and they've never been able to access those trails. And so organizations like ours across the state really work to help increase that access, both physical access as well as perceived access as well to those outdoor spaces. And then we take it a step further, as I was mentioning, to really engage youth as champions for some of these key policy shifts. I think about this over this past year, Tatiana, one of our youth leadership program graduates, who, as a part of the Parks Now Coalition efforts and as a part of our efforts in alignment with the California State Parks Foundation, was able to go up to the state capitol and talk about her moments, her experiences of awe, and what she calls, and she was asking me the other day how to trademark this statement, her here and now moment. I have this powerful picture here that if I can share screen later on, I'll share. But Tati experienced her here and now moment. She has a powerful story of resilience in and of herself that I would really allow her to share. But she talks about how getting out into the outdoors is not only an equity issue for her, but it was really healing, and it was restorative, and it helped her to overcome so many of the things that she had to overcome in life. And as a result of those healing experiences, those connective, those transformative experiences in the outdoors, she said, I want to champion these spaces, and I want to ensure that every youth in California really has the opportunity to get out into these spaces and to advocate for these spaces. that represents, that equity, that access represents the next generation, very real next generation of environmental stewards that are going to continue to carry this program forward. I think about Lexus, I think about Dion, as we were advocating for many of the pieces of legislation that we'll talk more about last year. Dion sat in rooms with legislators that were unlikely kind of candidates to support some of the initiatives or the pieces of legislation that we were putting forward. But as he walked inside the room and said, you know, I come from this parkour community in your district, and before accessing programs like outdoor outreach, I was never able to meaningfully experience a state park. He was able to effectively cultivate those champions. And so this work is so important, and just wanted to really highlight and emphasize the importance of diversity in this work. I really want to echo the comments of the previous panel as well around inclusion in this work. And then to get to your question about the impact of policy decisions to our work to local communities in San Diego and Southeast San Diego, these policy decisions have very real impacts on the ground. It's resulting in very real park development and improved park facilities for many of the projects in our city where maintenance has been deferred for decades. Thinking about Emerald Hills State Park, or sorry, Emerald Hills City Park, where maintenance was deferred for decades. Funding allocations from Prop 68 can help to develop those parks so that they're a safe, enjoyable place for families to be able to come and recreate. I also think about improved public transportation and access to parks and beaches. I think about funding that helps to support running programs like ours that get youth into the outdoors, and again, that promote health, mental health, and promotes unique non-traditional partnerships with healthcare organizations and with school systems and school districts to elevate the importance of the outdoors in those sectors as well. And then funding allocation, I know we'll talk a little bit more about kind of some of our future goals around creating workforce opportunities for youth that are both actively helping to support youth development, and really promote positive youth development, but that's also helping to diversify the workforce in the outdoor industry, and land management agencies and so forth. So these policy decisions have very real impacts, but we're incredibly grateful for this time, for this moment where this has become a priority across our state and really across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's so refreshing. I'm so glad to have your perspective on the local level, because I know, we've been talking a lot today about policy, and we're about to get even deeper into those details. But I think, just being able to reflect on the impacts that it has on people and on young people especially, it's been one of the more compelling parts of the work, especially the work that I've been able to work together on. And so I think I'm really happy to have your perspective here. And I think we can keep those stories as motivation as we work through some of the next pieces of our discussion, which is really diving a bit more deeper into the details. And for everybody sort of tuned in, this is going to be great context for us as we move forward into advocating for this stuff and really being that bridge that Secretary Crowfoot highlighted. And so I want to go back to Jaymee and sort of say, with COVID and with budget stuff we've been hearing about, we're definitely not where we expected to be. But I also want to say, we've heard some of it here, there's a lot to celebrate. And so, Jaymee, I'd love to have you start telling us a little bit about the policy, which you worked on directly. And I also want to encourage everybody else to sort of chime in for this as we work through some of the wonky details, some of the budget figures, and some of the policy.
Sure. So, two noteworthy pieces of legislation that I worked on while at Priority Strategies are AB 1680 and AB 209, both of which were authored by Assemblymember Limon. For those of you that aren't familiar, AB 1680 passed last year and was something that Azul sponsored to address an issue with public access to the coastline at Hollister Ranch in Santa Barbara, which was actively being restricted by nearby communities and landowners for decades. It's definitely a more regionally focused piece of legislation, but I think it's really worth mentioning here, even briefly, because on a broader level, it addressed a long-standing violation of the Coastal Act, where homeowners intentionally created barriers to prevent the public from accessing portions of the coast. So its passage last year was not just a huge win in terms of coastal access, but also in terms of upholding the integrity of the Coastal Act, like in its entirety. And the other bill that I mentioned, AB 209, also passed last year, and it was sponsored by Latino Outdoors, and it established the Outdoor Equity Grants Program at the Department of Parks and Recreation to provide funding for outdoor education opportunities and experiences for people who would otherwise lack access or face barriers to access. And I know I mentioned that the bill passed last year, but one really exciting development around AB 209 was that even with the constraints on the budget and the legislature announcing that all bills and budget appropriations this year needed to be directly tied to COVID response and relief, the final budget deal that was made between the legislature and the governor actually included $20 million specifically for this program. And if I'm not wrong, that's actually one of the only new appropriations made for a non-COVID related thing this year, which is pretty amazing and is allowing state parks to enter into this phase of developing this program, knowing that there are resources to actually administer it. And I know Les might have some additional comments in terms of like actually applying for the program and that kind of thing. So I'll hand it over to him. But before I do, I think what I want to say is that these wins, especially securing the funding for the AB 209 program, when like a lot of people were feeling discouraged and thought that it wasn't possible, is a direct result and testament of everyone's advocacy efforts on this. And I think that that's really something everyone should be proud of.
Awesome. Yeah, go for it.
Sure, and thank you, Amy or Jaymee. I'll actually defer just in the interest of time. I think that you covered that extraordinarily well, and I would just echo that we're extremely excited for the carry through on the Outdoor Equity Grant Program.
Awesome, thanks, Les. Well, I want to go to Alfredo to start. As you know, and as we've talked about, CORP was supportive of AB 3030 this year, both for its conservation goals as well as its climate goals, but also because some of the new language that was added that we heard about a little bit earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about how that helped and what you saw and maybe some surprises? Oh, I think you got to go off mute real quick. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll share what sort of I know, and I think Jaymee will be able to fill in the blanks. But you know, I have a background in biodiversity conservation, and you know, 3030 has been a concept that we've been thinking about for quite some time. And when it came up as a bill, I thought, well, this is great. The bill itself was it would have been very symbolic. It would have been sort of a national sort of, or a global sort of gesture about California's leadership on biodiversity. But you know, California, we're doing a pretty good job already, probably other than our sort of coastal resources. And so when the bill was making its way, and all of a sudden there was language that was getting brought in that was complicating it, and this was language around access and tribal consultation. At least in my mind, from a traditional sort of policy wonkish standpoint, I'm thinking this is good conceptually, but it's going to create some challenges because you're sort of creating the bill is changing sort of its direction. But lo and behold, surprising to me, and I think to a lot of people, that kind of language was resonating with members, and it actually was motivating for members. And some members were asking for more access or tribal recognition language in the bill if their vote was going to be cast. And that was something I would have never imagined. And so I don't know, Jaymee, if you've got anything else to add, but to me, that was sort of a really interesting dynamic that I didn't expect.
Yeah, and Jaymee, feel free to pile on, but I was also just going to say one of the interesting things about that language in that bill is just from my perspective was how it introduced the idea of valuing land and activities and inherent sort of biological ecosystems in ways that are different from sort of our traditional extraction versus conservation sort of dynamic. And so I think, you know, when you throw people on top of that and the recreation and the community health value for that land, I think, you know, it's a really exciting bill. And I know it was held up this year, but I know that everybody here at CORP is very excited to keep pushing when it comes back. Jaymee, anything to add?
No, I think you all covered it.
Awesome. Well, then maybe let's switch out of the legislation here and let's get into the propositions. And Alfredo, I'm going to go back to you to start about talking a little bit about Prop 68.
Yeah, so I'll mention a little bit, and I already sort of described it, so I'll try to be brief here. You know, in California, for the last 40 years, every 5 to 7 years, we go to the voters, typically with a bond. We heard earlier today, Wade Crowfoot sort of cryptically being not so fond of bonds. I think all of us have sort of our issues with bonds. I do think that they're not sort of maybe the smartest way to fund things, and they're very limited in what they can fund. However, we have a pretty successful track record in California of supporting the environment through passing bonds. Proposition 84, which was, I think, 2006, was the first bond that actually carved out resources to invest in urban and suburban underserved communities. That is where we created a bucket of money for parks and park poor communities, and where we created a fully defined program around improving river parkways and urban rivers in California. We've done a pretty terrible job of, you know, concreting in our rivers and turning them into storm drain channels. And this was, those channels often go through really underserved communities. So this was the funding mechanism to support revitalizing those areas. And that was sort of the transaction that occurred to get this measure on the ballot and to get the political support you need. What are the urban underserved communities going to get? Well, they'll get a slug of money for parks and park poor communities, and they'll get a slug of money to build or to revitalize urban river parkways. Here we are now, 2018, Proposition 68. Completely different legislature, completely different dynamic. This one was much more about how do we prioritize people? How do we make sure that through this bond, we invest in equity and justice and access? So there's funding in there for parks like we've never seen before. Now, state parks didn't receive nearly enough, but state parks got a fair amount of money, a lot of it for deferred maintenance. There was, like I mentioned earlier, $725 million of the $4 billion exclusively to build parks and to enhance and revitalize parks and park poor communities. There's a per capita program where every city and every park district gets a slug of money regardless of it's based on population. There was also one of the things that I was really proud of, and I'll be very quick on this one, but this is policy and funding in action in California. You know, we knew at Resources Legacy Fund and through the Parks Forward recommendations that access to the coast, which is a right to Californians, was being limited every year with less facilities, less low-cost accommodations, less places to go. So we did some research to ensure that the legislature was aware that the coast is in love by all, whether you live 10 feet or 100 miles from it. The coast is, people in California love the coast, and that we didn't have enough access to it. So we got a policy that required, this was AB 250, that required the state Parks Department and the Coastal Conservancy to plan for more low-cost overnight accommodations, campsites, and other things like that. Once that bill passed, we then hitched on to Prop 68 and identified $60 million to actually build that infrastructure. So in the 3-year span, we went from, we think we need more coastal low-cost accommodations, to we're going to require the state to plan for it, to here's $60 million to build it. And this was due in part to a lot of advocacy and a lot of great work, but Prop 68 really sort of is now sort of the flagship of how we're going to be doing these measures going forward. And you heard from Assemblywoman Friedman as well as Mr. Garcia that they're committed to a resilience bond. And you better bet that that resilience bond is going to have humans front and center on it.
Awesome. Yeah, super helpful. Marc, you and I both sort of followed Prop 68 closely. Anything you want to add from your perspective there?
Maybe this risks stating the obvious, but one of the reasons why this outdoor sector, why this human connectivity to nature movement, if you will, seems to be picking up momentum despite all sorts of obstacles elsewhere on the political front, is that people are coming to the conversation with a really big tent mindset, and how to make the tent even bigger and more inclusive. And when you have that, big tent, super inclusive mindset, I think you just set yourself up well for touching on what's in all of us as humans, which is like a natural resonance about the importance of time outdoors to us and to our friends and our family. And that's why you have, super strong results in Congress on some of these topics. And that's why when it comes to, not just Prop 68, but other propositions across the country, usually the voters vote for them really, really strongly. Like you get these things in front of people and people are like, hell yeah, this is the type of work by government that we want to see done, and we will tax ourselves to get it done. So, I guess this was your closing comment, Alfredo, that this is sort of the model for going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Well, there's two options we have here to sort of close the panel. We do have the ability for questions from the audience. So there is, just click on your Q&A there and you guys can submit questions. The last thing we were going to talk about really quickly was Prop 64, but I think, just in the interest of time and in serving the audience, I'd like to open it up for questions. If somebody does want to hear a little bit about Prop 64, which is a legalized marijuana bill that has some interesting pieces to it, put that in the Q&A box and we will touch on it. But otherwise, yeah, I will open it up for questions. I'll give a minute or so for people to pop those in, and as soon as we see them, we'll start getting after them. I think I will be the only one to see them, so I'll kind of prop them up for the panelists, and people can feel free to chime in. Okay, here they come. Great. So the first one is thinking about the comments around the propositions. How do we create or transform the existing system that supports the integration of the human side that you referenced? Propositions are usually one-time things. So what Chelsea is looking at is how are we creating policies that don't just support more access, but focus on addressing the institutional silos that perpetuate the inequity we're talking about today. So consider things like organizational capacity to foster partnerships. So that was a mouthful. Thanks, Chelsea, but hopefully we can dig in.
Hey, Eric, I could definitely take a stab at that. And actually, I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of loop in Prop 64 as well. I think the implementation of Prop 64 really does get at that human side of what we're trying to do through this outdoor equity movement. You often hear me talk about, the importance of positive youth development through outdoor engagement. I often say, the resilience of our lands, the resilience of our coast, the resilience of our parks, our beaches will depend on the resilience of those that get to thrive and experience them, and vice versa, right? And so the importance of positive youth development and resilience building programs in those spaces are so key. Prop 64, through the allocation that was made through the Natural Resources Agency, about a 5% allocation that was made that represents about 5.7 million this year, represents an investment by, and really the first of its kind by the Natural Resources Agency to connect and to link the prevention of substance use, as well as resilience building, positive youth development activities. It connects that to outdoor engagement. And so why that's important is I think that's a key opportunity for conversations to now develop between the Natural Resources Agency and other agencies. And I know that those conversations are happening already with the Department of Healthcare Services, the Department of Public Health as well, to really look at how can we continue to grow and expand outdoor engagement, and how it's meeting critical mental health health, and social needs. And so I think that's a key part of that allocation. I'm really looking forward to some of the innovative ways that the Natural Resources Agency is looking to utilize that funding. I know that the Youth Community Access Grant is out currently, I believe closing next week. And we're excited to submit a collaborative proposal on that. But I think that that's a key example of how proposition funding can be used to really emphasize that human side of what we're doing as well.
Yeah, thanks. A follow-up question on that, which is somewhat similar. There's a startling stat. It's estimated that 3 out of 4 outdoor education nonprofits may close permanently due to impacts from COVID. What are some ways we can prevent this from happening as these places and organizations were already working to create equity for our youth in the first place?
All right, I'm assuming that one's coming to me as well. Yeah, so COVID has definitely, and I'll speak candidly from a nonprofit organization perspective, COVID has definitely been challenging for us as an organization. We definitely had to shift and adapt how we did programs pretty significantly, running several virtual programs, still working to engage youth through environmental education curriculum, through leadership development curriculum. And then importantly, what we were also doing was we were putting out information to our community and to our families on how they can responsibly recreate outdoors as well. So we had to navigate and adapt, but we also
I have a comment that I think might bridge the two questions. It is, the pandemic and the economic fallout is just, crushing lots of different sectors. And surviving is kind of a revenue issue. At the co-op, we're doing our best to stay true to our philanthropic commitments, but even we had to pare back our budget a little bit to deal with the first several months of economic fallout. I would, picking up on Les's point, encourage folks to think about how, by virtue of being in the outdoor sector, you're actually maybe in additional sectors. We are investing in research that demonstrates the health value, the mental and physical health value of time outdoors. There was some research done at Cal Berkeley that we worked on with the Sierra Club. We're supporting Nusheen Razani at UCSF. She's looking at park prescriptions and whether the insurance community would start providing insurance coverage for prescribed time outdoors. And then to what extent, are we learning that nature is actually a natural classroom? So this is not a short-term answer by any stretch, but the society invests extraordinarily in healthcare, yet we still have subpar health outcomes, especially for traditionally marginalized communities, and same for education. As we move forward, to what extent do we look to bust silos and talk about the fact that time outdoors should be seen as, or access to the outdoors should be seen as, an investment in our well-being and in the development of our youth, and get better returns in both those other spaces by bringing part of the outdoors in? That's sort of a big picture, long-term answer, not a short-term one relative to the question that centered on the pandemic, but perhaps we could start laying some of the groundwork for that type of transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, definitely being cognizant of those realities is something that we're all sort of, we've touched on a little bit in our discussion and some of the impacts that it had. But also, on the flip side, we're all sort of acknowledging the importance that people have found in time spent outside as a result of COVID, and hopefully the acceleration of this sort of inflection point that we're in right now, that we'll be able to carry that forward. And so with that, we're out of time. We're clear out of time, and so I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for joining, Les, Alfredo, Jaymee, and Marc, and sharing your expertise and educating us on some of this, the previous wins. And I think we've got more to come in terms of how we're all working together to advocate for more as we move forward. So with that, I will close up shop. There's a couple other questions that we'll try and answer offline. But once again, thanks everybody for your expertise. Really enjoyed spending time with you. And I will pass it back to Kitty and Lexi.
Thanks much.